Good morning. My name is Miguel Lopez, and it is really a pleasure to be a part of this program called Worldviews, Latin American Art, and the Decolonial Turn. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel, organized by Cecilia Fajardo Gil. This panel is entitled Political Bodies, Gender, and Race. And I've been thinking a lot about how to contribute to this seminar. And after thinking about many possibilities, for example, some artists and practices from Central America, I thought that perhaps the idea of the decolonial turn and the idea of decolonizing certain narratives could be more akin to a political performative product that I have been involved with for several years here in Lima, Peru. So that's what I'm going to share with you now. It is going to be about the work of the Museo Travesti del Perú, which is the Transvestite Museum of Peru. I'm going to share my screen. The Transvestite Museum of Peru project, founded by philosopher and transvestite Giuseppe Campuzano in 2004, is an attempt at queer counter-reading and promiscuous intersectional thinking about history, which collected representations, images, press clippings, textiles, and works to come up with initiatives, installations, and publications. One of the achievements of this museum was to place in the public debate the urgency of imagining new models of community from transgender narratives, unpacking the foundational myths and fantasies that are hidden under the slogan of the state, founding a new nation for a new body, as Giuseppe Campuzano said. During the 1990s, Giuseppe Campuzano had begun to explore the possibilities of her transgender body, theatricalizing sexual normality unabashedly at parties, marches, fairs, and galleries. Campuzano was part of a community of friends, fags, sex workers, and transgender activists who were seeking to create safe spaces for self-expression. It was a battle through makeup, dance, wigs, and a lot of humor, along with her closest allies, like the ones that you can see here on the left, Germain Machuca, Eduardo La Duda Bermejo, and Susana Torres, all creators of languages, gestures, styles, and universes of glamorous dissidence. That space of revolt and love was one of the engines, let's say, of the Transvestite Museum's fantasies. Campuzano's critical distance from the process of media transvestite domestication during the 90s, the years of Alberto Fujimori's dictatorship in Peru, as well as the impossibility of recognizing herself in a deeply misogynistic, racist, and classist history, triggered her desire to initiate a visual and philosophical archaeology of the transvestite body. In a 2008 interview, Campuzano noted, "I see transvestism as a ritual, like the priest who performs a liturgy or the shaman in native cultures. Understood as an allegory of the mask, of the false, of the copy and camouflage, transvestism began to serve him as a concept capable of accounting for the processes of colonization, resistance, hybridization, and miscegenation. The Transvestite Museum, halfway between performance and historical research, proposes a critical review of the so-called history of Peru from the strategic perspective of a fictitious political individual that Campuzano calls the indigenous androgynous mestizo transvestite. Campuzano had a great intuition. It was necessary to cannibalize one of the most effective devices of political disciplining since modernity, one of the most perfected Western promises of truth, in his words, the museum, in order to be able to break the centrality of certain knowledge and reread that narrative that has been sold to us as history. Their methodologies based on asynchrony and their twisted strategies of exhibition, the museum used as a Trojan horse, sought to establish a different relationship with history that would denaturalize expectations of scientific truth and total legibility, deploying forms of belonging different from the narratives of the nation state and claiming social models that would pierce and deflect the demands of national identity. The strategic use of the name Peru at the time of founding the Transvestite Museum was an attempt to recognize that all imposed national identities are always themselves forms of transvestism. All Peruvianness is transvestism was one of her favorite phrases and was also the name of a performance. The Transvestite Museum never existed as a physical building. It was always a fictitious place that phagocytized the idea of a museum to question the processes of preserving history in a racist and homophobic society. However, this museum did have a collection. From its founding, the project sought to compose an assembly of representations, objects, oral memories, and documents collected with the help of her transgender family. It was not a collection of transvestite objects as if it were a detective searching for the overlooked transvestites in history, but rather an operation that transvestified and queered historiographical methods themselves, their modes of display, and the normative systems of meaning socially erected as truths. In 2004, the Transvestite Museum made its first appearance as a parasitic intervention at the Museo de Sitio de la Batalla de Miraflores that you can see here. It's a municipal museum commemorating the War of the Pacific between Peru, Chile, and Bolivia in the late 19th century. The title of Campuzano's intervention here, Certamen, el otro sitio, was a play on words that alluded to a tension between military combat and the beauty pageant, also pointing to these persecuted sexual communities under siege. The intervention took place in two small rooms, usually used to exhibit contemporary art, but it also extended to the rooms of the permanent exhibition, where the events of the war were presented. There, the Transvestite Museum displayed photocopies, photographs, objects linked to transvestite culture, displaying a colorful amalgam of androgynous shamans, gay hairdressers, and beauty queens, creating a counterpoint between the emblems of nationalist heroism and those minority heroics of bodies that have to confront the normative social order in order to continue living. The objects of the Transvestite Museum ridiculed exacerbated masculinity, puncturing patriarchal representations of conflict and confronting the colonial character of official narratives. Shortly after, the Transvestite Museum moved to downtown Lima, converted into a small pink kiosk set up with cheap objects, banners, and paper prints. Located at the entrance of one of the busiest public parts in the area, this new street appearance was an index of the parasitic condition of the project that from then on would begin to occupy different public and institutional spaces, posing questions around from which individuals must we narrate stories? Unlike large institutional projects and their discourses of authority, the Transvestite Museum did not aspire to represent minorities and incorporate them into the dominant discourses of progress and happiness. On the contrary, it is an artificial device that confronts the privileged place of heterosexual subjectivity that has historically turned all difference into an object of study and has made its own socially constructed condition invisible. But the Transvestite Museum's itinerant condition also alluded to other movements, the migrant displacement of the popular masses between the provinces and the capital, mestizos and cholos that disarrange social hierarchies and reorganize different ways of living and linking and connecting with the territory. But also those other forms of migration of bodies, which the violence of the normative structures places on the edge of life and death, the HIV positive, the undocumented, the intersex, among others. This moving condition or portable condition of the museum, its capacity to parasitize any scenario from public squares and neighborhood fairs to university congresses and institutional spaces, allowed it to question the orthodox subject of struggle, of activism and militancy, thus opposing an ambiguous, amorphous, and ungraspable political subject. The experimental approach vandalized classical theory and history in a kind of punk rewriting that sought to supply itself with imaginaries, references, and knowledge for an individual incapable of recognizing themselves in existing taxonomies. And this is also linked to the way Campuzano always avoided defining himself as a curador or curadora and his role of power and authority. The fact that in Latin America curadores have usually been confused with curanderos allowed him to claim a genealogy not of curadores but of shamans, queer shamans whose practices involve the cosmetics of subjectivity, states of consciousness, and of social and political bodily energies. So in that sense, Campuzano shifted from the idea of being the museum curator to being the queer shaman of the musex, forging new alliances between the transgender community and their indigenous ancestors. The work parodied the rigidity and defined edges of gender, noticing how a wide repertoire of queer images and denormalized practices manage to intervene in the social dynamics that shape our subjectivity. In that sense, the Transvestite Museum can be thought of as a large archive of performative exercises that challenged the sites of traditional analysis of oppression by taking the trans body as the locus of its enunciations, a false, prosthetic body whose nature is uncertainty, as Campuzano would say. The twisted readings of the Transvestite Museum have emerged from the different ways of composing its collection, activating a queer review of the past through momentary concepts or categories for the occasion. Some of these invented and used categories are therapeutic, duality, plumaria, perceptive, revolution, epic, mestizaje, among others, and I will just mention two. The first, plumaria, took the feather as a pretext to construct an iconographic journey that began with the great imperial dress of Manco Cápac, the first leader of the Inca Empire, to continue with the Baroque paintings of the Harquebusiers, angels of the Cusqueñan school in the 18th century, and connect them with the costumes of contemporary vedettes and drag queens. This is definitely one of my favorite sections of the entire project. Presenting Manco Cápac, the leader of the Inca Empire, as the first fag, the first undercover queer bitch, and thus the goddess of a whole variety of indigenous queers, it was brilliantly marvelous. If the Incas were one of the most important drag queen communities between the 13th and 15th century and we didn't know it, that means that history needs to be rewritten. In another cartography called Mestizaje, the museum gave an account of ethnic and sexual migrations and these other geopolitics of the body. Here we can see the limas tapadas, which are women with covered faces, a legacy of the Spanish Moorish presence since the 16th century during the viceroyalty in Peru, that entered into dialogue with photographs like this one on the left we have here a Chinese opera singer from 1870 in Lima, cross-dressed and made up as part of the Chinese community's theater performances where male bodies represented female roles. Or with the images of blacks and queers represented by watercolorists of the expeditions and voyages of the Scientific Commission of the Pacific in the 19th century. And it's interesting to think how some of these images reappear performatively in public spaces in some actions and situations, and I will mention this a little bit further. Campuzano also explored forms of local religion, straining the sacredness of certain representations through performances that staged an apocryphal queer devotion. In 2007, Giuseppe emulated a sort of Marian apparition. Giuseppe stood motionless on a cliff on a beach in Lima, made up and disguised or cross-dressed as the Virgen de las Huacas, Our Lady of Sorrows, inducing truncated pilgrimages. Those passers-by who imagined seeing a virgin on the seashore rushed forward until they saw the faggot and hastily retreated. Another important aspect are the performances that I mentioned, where Campuzano and several collaborators staged multiple characters and representations of the Transvestite Museum collection. And these are some good examples of an erotic and bodily relationship with knowledge and of a form of curatorial experimentation, curanderil and shamanic, that eludes social anxiety and the normative demands of visual identification. This process is of ritual collective performances in the form of Andean celebration, where all the characters celebrated their return and reappearance. And this would undo the distinctions between factual and mythological, living and inanimate, but also between interpreting and feeling. And from an Andean philosophical perspective, this can be understood according to a cyclical understanding of time. In traditional Andean world philosophy, the past and the present are part of a non-linear, non-deterministic concept of time, which is based on loops or convolutions. And in Quechua, they're called pacha. Invoking these choreographies of imaginary subjects or individuals was also an attempt to transform their collection into a resource and offer it for collective use. Following a reflection by American critic and activist Greg Bordowitz, queer re-significations of the past represent the act of taking control of history by claiming to be its own subject through repetition. Rather than producing a revolutionary break with history, the artist repeats moments of queer liberation over and over again to the point where the past becomes a permanent present tense. Close quotation marks. This means going beyond simply showing or exhibiting bodies, things, or representations. Instead, it means becoming these episodes and experiences, and we can see Giuseppe here cross-dressed, and he published a book in 2008 about the Transvestite Museum, and here you can see her with all of the individuals from the museum. The practices of transvestism and the operations of reconstruction and self-modeling of one's own body allow to bring together elements that belong to different moments in history and create connections in different ways. And this means recognizing how the body is a tool for investigating the past. And now I'm going to start finishing my presentation. I wanted to share the way which performative practice and experimental strategies of historical research allow us to renew the ways of social intervention and even rethink the meanings of a space like museums. In that sense, transvestism as Giuseppe Campuzano's work and the Transvestite Museum of Peru show, help us to show or to think about the possibilities of assembling queer cartographies that do not fall back on a taxonomy of fixed identity, but instead allow us to see how the meaning of bodies are and can be historically and artificially produced. Giuseppe Campuzano leaves the stage open so that we can continue fantasizing, learning, unlearning, disorganizing, and going beyond normative limits to undermine places of power and authority, to interrupt, to falsify, to throw the heteronormative gaze or perspective in the trash, to generate infiltrations, to dismantle and render strange the very idea of the museum, to satirize, to open up possibilities that redraw not only the past but also the future. Thank you very much.